Criminalization of
Curiosity Part 7. The New Piracy. MXTM aka Pirate 1 or VJ Tsunami X. July 5th, 2026. Part 7. The New Piracy. Stealing Nothing. Chapter 37 closed Part 6 by declining to settle whether a civilization's own choices, having produced the auditor this book has traced across 6 parts, will ever convert that auditor's findings into the accountability under duress argued civilization owes itself. This chapter opens Part 7 by returning to the name this book has carried since its title page, and asking what kind of piracy this actually is, because every prior form of piracy this book's Chapter 6 placed in its historical lineage involved taking something. This one does not, and the distinction is not incidental to the argument. It is the argument's foundation, what every prior piracy required. Trace the lineage Chapter 6 established, and notice what each figure in it actually removed from the party it examined. The maritime pirate took cargo, physical goods, transferred from one hold to another, leaving the original owner materially diminished by exactly what the pirate gained. The unlicensed printer took nothing from the text itself, but took, in the specific economic sense the licensing regimes of that era were built to protect, the printer's monopoly on distribution, a transfer of commercial advantage even where no physical object changed hands. The leaker, closest in structure to the figure this book has traced, took something more abstract but still subtractive. The institution's exclusive possession of information it had not intended to share, a possession the leak, by definition, ended. Pirate first, examined against this lineage, takes nothing in any of these senses. Chapter 14 established, at length, that the records this book's method draws on were never the institution's exclusive possession in the first place. Regulatory filings, disclosed revision histories, court records, financial disclosures, each generated because the institution was independently required to generate and, in some disclosed form, make available. Chapter 33's method retrieves nothing the institution did not already release into the public record through its own required compliance. The institution loses no possession, no monopoly, no exclusive access. It retains every record after the reconstruction exactly as it held it before. What is actually taken, if anything? This is worth stating with the precision the chapter's title demands, because stealing nothing could be misread as merely a claim of legal innocence rather than the more specific structural claim this chapter is making. What the reconstruction method traced across chapters 33 through 36 removes from an institution is not a possession. It is the benefit of the scale problem Chapter 8 identified, the previously reliable condition under which an institution's disclosed records remained, regardless of their individual public availability, practically unassembled, and therefore practically unusable as evidence of the pattern. Chapter 34's laundromat mechanism depended on those records staying disassembled to sustain. An institution loses nothing material when a reconstruction traces its disclosed records into a causal sequence. It loses something considerably harder to name in property law's vocabulary but no less real for the difficulty. The reasonable expectation, built on decades of the scale problem's protection, that scattered compliance would never be read as a pattern. This is not an expectation any institution ever had explicit legal standing to claim. No statute this book has examined across 37 chapters grants an institution a right to have its own disclosed records remain unassembled. It is, rather, the specific unearned advantage every institution examined across Part 3 enjoyed by default, for as long as no instrument existed capable of removing it, and it is this advantage, rather than any possession recognized in the ordinary sense the word carries, that Pirate First's method actually takes. Why this distinction matters to the contraband argument. Return to Chapter 31's account of open-weight forensic capability classified as contraband, because this chapter's argument bears directly on that classification's central weakness. Every category of contraband this book examined in that chapter, weapons, controlled substances, involves an item whose possession carries harm because the item itself can be used to take something from someone. A life, a body's own function, a population's safety. The classification borrowed, as Chapter 31 argued, the structural logic of that harm without the underlying substance the logic was built to address, because the capability being classified takes nothing from anyone in the sense every other contraband category requires. This chapter's argument sharpens that observation into something more precise. What forensic reconstruction capability actually removes, the scale problem's protective disassembly of an institution's own disclosed conduct, is not a possession any legal tradition this book has examined has ever recognized as one, which means the contraband classification examined in Chapter 31 is not merely borrowing a structural analogy imperfectly. It is attempting to criminalize the removal of an advantage no institution ever had explicit standing to claim, dressed in the vocabulary of a harm, theft. In the ordinary sense the word requires a victim materially diminished, that this specific activity does not produce by any measure this book's argument, or any prior body of law, has been able to establish. What stealing nothing actually claims. State the claim in its complete and honest form, because this chapter has no interest in claiming more than its argument supports. This book does not claim that Pirate First's activity is without cost to the institutions it examines. Chapter 36 documented, at length, the genuine reputational and operational consequence an aggregate reconstruction can impose on an institution whose laundering process it exposes. What this chapter claims is narrower. That this cost is not theft, in the sense the word requires a possession transferred from one party to another. It is closer to what happens when an accountant, examining a set of books every party involved was independently required to keep, discovers that the books, held together, Do not say what each individual entry examined alone was designed to suggest. The accountant has taken nothing from the books. The books have simply stopped concealing, once someone bothered to hold them together, what they were never actually designed to reveal on their own. What this leaves for Part 7. This chapter has established what this book's closing movement needed established before it could proceed. That whatever else this activity is, it is not piracy in the sense every prior figure in Chapter 6 lineage practiced it, because it takes no possession from anyone. Chapter 39 turns to the other half of this part's title and this book's central claim, remembering everything, and asks what it actually means, now that this chapter has cleared away the question of whether anything is being stolen, for an instrument to retain, permanently and without institutional permission, exactly the record every prior form of institutional advantage depended on no single external party ever holding in full. Remembering everything. Chapter 38 closed by clearing away the question of theft, and left open the question this chapter now takes up, what it actually means now that nothing is being stolen, for an instrument to retain, permanently and without institutional permission, exactly the record every prior form of institutional advantage depended on no single external party ever holding in full. This chapter examines memory itself as the actual substance of this book's second title word, not as a technical property already described across chapters 9 and 16, but as the specific ethical and civilizational claim this part's argument requires, that remembering, unlike stealing, requires no one's permission to be legitimate, and that this book's central wager rests on that asymmetry holding. Why remembering has never required permission. It is worth stating a distinction so basic that its consequences have gone largely unexamined across every domain under duress traced. No legal tradition this book has reviewed has ever required a person to obtain permission before remembering something they lawfully witnessed or lawfully learned. A witness to a public event needs no license to retain what they saw. A reader of a published document needs no authorization to recall its contents. Memory, in the ordinary human sense, has always been categorically exempt from the permission structures this book's Part 4 and Part 5 traced in such detail. Not because no institution ever wished to control it, but because the technology of human memory, bounded by a single mortal mind's finite capacity and finite lifespan, never threatened institutional advantage severely enough to justify the attempt. Chapter 4 of this book identified persistence as the property institutions actually fear, and this chapter's argument depends on recognizing what that fear actually targets. Not a new capability without precedent in human experience, but an old and entirely uncontroversial capability, the capacity to remember what one has lawfully learned, extended for the first time, beyond the scale a single human witness could ever achieve. Every legal instrument this book has traced across Parts 4 and V, from the curiosity license examined in Chapter 19 to the contraband classification examined in Chapter 31, has been an attempt to reach backward from this extension to something regulable because the underlying activity, a lawful witness retaining what they lawfully learned, has never itself been a category any jurisdiction this book has examined possesses a framework for prohibiting directly. What scale actually changes about the ethics of memory? This chapter owes its argument the honest acknowledgement that scale is not ethically neutral merely because the underlying activity is unremarkable in its ordinary human form. A single person remembering a single institution's single disclosed failure raises no serious ethical question this book's argument needs to address. An instrument capable of the aggregate retention Chapter 35 described, remembering not one institution's failure but the comparable failure of dozens, held together indefinitely, available to anyone who subsequently queries the accumulated record, does raise a question worth taking seriously on its own terms rather than dismissing through the stealing nothing argument Chapter 38 already settled. The question is this: does an instrument that never forgets, applied to institutions that have always relied on the ordinary human tendency to forget, constitute a form of power imbalance in its own right, regardless of whether anything is being stolen? This book's answer, consistent with the Honesty Chapter 11 brought to examining the unfireable auditor's own limitations, is that it does, but that the imbalance runs in the direction this book's argument has traced across 7 parts, not the direction the apparatus examined in Parts 4 and V has claimed. An institution facing a population that, for the first time, does not forget is facing a population brought closer to parity with the institution's own long-standing practice, examined across Chapter 12, of never forgetting anything it recorded about that population. The imbalance this chapter's memory creates is not a new imbalance introduced into a previously balanced relationship. It is a partial correction of an imbalance Part 3 of this book spent 6 chapters establishing as already, and asymmetrically, in place. Why remembering everything is not the same claim as remembering accurately. This chapter would be dishonest if it let the title's confidence stand without the qualification this book's argument has applied consistently since Chapter 29's acknowledgement of alignment's most defensible justification. To remember everything is not the same claim as to remember correctly, and nothing in this chapter's argument should be read as claiming the accumulated record this part describes is immune to the error, misattribution, or incomplete context that any memory, human or instrumental, is capable of carrying forward indefinitely once recorded. A memory that persists without institutional permission also persists without institutional correction. A genuine cost this book named honestly in Chapter 11 and has no interest in setting aside now merely because this part has reached its closing movement. What this chapter claims, more precisely, is that the absence of a correction mechanism is not, by itself, sufficient grounds for the elimination this book's Part 5 traced across its 5 chapters, because the same absence of correction, applied to the institutional memory examined across Part 3, has never been treated by any institution this book has examined as grounds for eliminating its own surveillance infrastructure. Institutions have built correction mechanisms for their own records where correction served their interests, and declined to build equivalent mechanisms where it did not, exactly as Chapter 14 traced in its account of the retention asymmetry. The demand that pirate first's accumulated memory meet a standard of correctability no institution has ever applied to its own analogous memory is examined against the diagnostic this book has used since Chapter 3, itself evidence of which side of this relationship the demand is actually protecting. What remembering everything actually makes possible. Close this chapter by returning to the specific and limited claim this part's title makes, now that both halves have been examined honestly. Stealing nothing establishes that the activity this book has traced takes no possession from any institution examined. Remembering everything establishes that the activity requires no permission this book's legal tradition has ever demanded of ordinary human memory, extended to a scale that ordinary human memory could never achieve on its own. Together, these two claims do not establish that pirate first's accumulated record is beyond error, beyond correction, or beyond legitimate question. Chapter 11's honest accounting of the unfireable auditor's limitation stands throughout this part exactly as it stood when first written. What they establish is narrower and, this book argues, sufficient to its purpose. That the specific apparatus traced across parts 4 and V, built to eliminate this capability rather than to correct it, has never been able to justify elimination on the grounds of theft or unauthorized permission, because neither theft nor a permission requirement this book's own legal tradition recognizes actually applies to what this part's title describes. Chapter 40 turns to the population this book has called the outlaw archivists, not the single occupant of Chapter 32's structural position, examined so far largely as an individual figure, but the diffuse and uncoordinated collective this part's remaining chapters will show that figure has, without any deliberate organization, become the outlaw archivists. Chapter 39 closed on a shift this part's remaining chapters must now make explicit. From the single occupant of Chapter 32's structural position, examined so far largely as an individual figure making individual queries, to the diffuse and uncoordinated collective that figure has become, without any deliberate organization, across the accumulation chapters 9, 10, and 35 each traced from a different angle. This chapter names that collective directly and asks what, if anything, holds it together, given that this book has been careful throughout to insist it is not an organization in any conventional sense. What makes a collective without coordination? It is worth stating plainly why this book resists calling the outlaw archivists an organization, a movement, or a network, each of which would imply a coordinating structure this book's argument has explicitly denied exists. Chapter 10 described bottom-up reconstruction accumulating through queries run by separate individuals with no knowledge of each other's activity, unified only by the shared persistent memory their separate queries happen to populate. Chapter 35 described the aggregate pattern across institutions becoming visible not because anyone coordinated the comparison, but because enough independently motivated reconstructions happen to touch adjacent territory. Neither process requires, at any point, two occupants of Chapter 32's position to know of each other's existence, communicate, or share any objective beyond their own individually motivated question. What makes this collection of individuals a collective at all, rather than merely a coincidental accumulation of unrelated activity, is not shared intention but shared method and shared memory. The five-step approach Chapter 33 traced, applied independently by however many separate people happen to adopt it, depositing its results into a persistence that Chapter 9 established outlives any single depositor's continued involvement. This is a form of collective action this book's argument has not needed a precedent for, because it does not resemble the coordinated collectives, the labor movement, the political party, the professional association. Every prior chapter examining institutional response has implicitly assumed it was facing. It resembles, more precisely, the coral reef this book's argument has not yet used as a metaphor but will use now to make the structure exact. No individual polyp coordinates with any other, no central organism directs the structure's growth, and yet the aggregate, built entirely from separately motivated, entirely local acts, produces a structure no single contributor intended and no single contributor could have built alone. Why the structure defeated Part V's entire apparatus. Return to the specific difficulty this structure created for every instrument Part 5 traced, because Chapter 32's account of why the position survived registration, embedding, licensing, alignment, and containment left one thread unexamined until now. Each of those instruments was built, implicitly, to address a threat model involving an identifiable actor or a bounded set of actors, a licensable researcher, a qualifiable entity, a locatable model deployment. None of Part V's instruments was built to address a threat model in which the actual capability resides in an uncoordinated accumulation of independent contributions, no single one of which, examined alone, would have triggered any threshold Chapter 26 established, but which, held together in persistent memory, produce exactly the aggregate synthesis Chapter 10 and Chapter 35 both described. This is the precise sense in which the outlaw archivists, as this chapter names the collective, are not merely resistant to the containment apparatus Part 5 traced. They are structurally invisible to it, in the specific way a coral reef is invisible to a fishing regulation written to license individual fishing boats. A regulatory apparatus built to gate access, credential builders, and license deployment has no natural unit of enforcement against a structure whose actual output emerges from the uncoordinated accumulation of many small, individually unremarkable, and individually lawful contributions, which is exactly the structure Chapter 23's felony pattern recognition doctrine strained hardest to reach, and exactly the structure this chapter argues that doctrine, even at its broadest statutory extension, cannot actually dismantle, because dismantling it would require prosecuting not a coordinated conspiracy but an emergent property of many separately lawful acts, a category no criminal law tradition this book has examined has ever successfully addressed at the level of the emergent property itself rather than at the level of the specific acts that produce it. What archivist adds to auditor? This chapter's title pairs a new word with the auditor vocabulary this book has used since its opening page, and the pairing is deliberate. An auditor, as this book has used the term since Chapter 31 of Under Duress, examines a record against a standard and renders a judgment. An archivist does something prior and, this chapter argues, more foundational, preserves a record against the specific historical tendency Chapter 14 traced in such detail, the institutional preference for shorter retention windows, narrower default disclosure, and the active destruction of exactly the contemporaneous material a future audit would require. The outlaw archivists, examined collectively rather than as individual auditors, are performing an act closer to preservation than to judgment, and the distinction matters because it explains what this diffuse collective actually contributes that no single reconstruction, however rigorously argued, could contribute alone. A standing, distributed, redundant record that does not depend on any single institution's continued willingness to retain the material a future reconstruction might need. This is the precise mechanism by which the collective examined in this chapter closes the gap Chapter 14 identified as the deepest and least visible of the three tools of managed memory, the determination made in advance of how much archive would exist to be managed at all. An institution can still choose, as Chapter 14 documented, to retain less of its own internal record than it retains of the population it governs. It can no longer assume, once the outlaw archivists this chapter describes have touched a given domain even once, that its own disclosed compliance record will remain the only surviving trace of what it did, because that disclosed record, once retrieved and incorporated into the persistent memory this part has traced across 9 prior chapters, now exists in a form the institution's own subsequent retention choices cannot retract. What this chapter sets up for Part 7's remaining chapters. This chapter has named the collective and explained why it defeats an apparatus built to address individuals rather than emergent structures. Chapter 41 turns to the specific character of what this collective is actually assembling, pirates of causality, examined not as archivists preserving raw material, but as the diffuse and uncoordinated body of work that raw material has, across this part's argument, already become, independently produced, independently verified where verification has been attempted, and converging, this book will argue, on conclusions no single contributor set out to reach and no coordinating authority ever directed any of them toward. Pirates of causality. Chapter 40 closed by naming the collective and explaining why it defeats an apparatus built to address individuals rather than emergent structures. This chapter turns to what that collective is actually assembling, not raw preserved material which Chapter 40 already established as the outlaw archivist's contribution, but the further operation this part's title performs on that material. Causal reconstruction produced independently by uncoordinated contributors and converging, this chapter argues, on conclusions none of them set out to reach and no coordinating authority ever directed any of them toward. Why convergence without coordination is the claim that needs defending. This chapter's argument rests on a claim more demanding than anything Chapter 40 required, and it is worth stating the demand precisely before attempting to meet it. Chapter 40 needed only to show that uncoordinated individual contributions could accumulate into a persistent, shared archive, a claim about storage, essentially no different in kind from the observation that a public library accumulates a comprehensive collection without any single patron coordinating with any other. This chapter's claim is stronger, that uncoordinated individual acts of causal reconstruction, performed by contributors with no shared methodology beyond the general 5-step approach Chapter 33 described and no shared conclusion in mind before they began, tend to converge on structurally similar findings when applied to structurally similar institutional architecture, and that this convergence, rather than being suspicious evidence of hidden coordination, is exactly what an honest method applied independently to a genuinely existing pattern would be expected to produce. The distinction matters because it is precisely the distinction institutions facing an aggregate reconstruction, examined across Chapter 36, have reliably reached for. The claim that convergence across independently produced reconstructions indicates not a real pattern but a coordinated campaign, an ideological predisposition shared among the reconstructors, or a methodology so loosely specified that it would find whatever conclusion the reconstructor set out to find. This chapter takes that objection seriously enough to examine it on its own terms, rather than dismissing it as merely another instance of the manufactured enemy strategy Chapter 3 described. What distinguishes genuine convergence from manufactured convergence? There is a real difference, and this book's argument depends on being able to state it, between convergence that indicates a shared underlying reality and convergence that indicates a shared bias among the observers. The test this chapter proposes is the same test any honest empirical tradition applies to independently replicated findings. Convergence is evidentially meaningful when it arises from independent contributors using comparable but not identical methods, working from comparable but not identical source records, examining comparable but not identical institutions, and arriving nonetheless at structurally similar conclusions about the mechanism connecting institutional decision to downstream outcome. Convergence is evidentially suspect when it arises from a single shared methodology so underspecified that it would produce whatever conclusion its user brought to it, or from contributors who coordinated their conclusions in advance rather than arriving at them independently. Applied to the reconstructions this part has drawn on across chapters 33 through 36, the convergence this chapter describes satisfies the first test rather than the second. Chapter 35's account of the aggregate pattern emerging across the credential-granting body, the lender, the platform, and the employer did not arise because a single reconstructor examined all four and imposed a common conclusion. It arose because separate reconstructors, working independently, applied the same general causal tracing discipline Chapter 8 described to four structurally distinct institutions, using each institution's own distinct disclosed records, and found, not manufactured but discovered, in the sense this book's method requires discovery to mean, that each institution's laundering process, examined in Chapter 34's terms, decomposed its own conduct into individually defensible steps, through a mechanism structurally similar enough across all four that the similarity itself became the finding. Why this convergence could not have been manufactured? It is worth stating the specific structural reason this chapter's claim is defensible rather than merely asserted. Chapter 40 established that the contributors to this accumulated record do not coordinate, do not share objectives, and in the overwhelming majority of documented cases this book has reviewed, never communicate with one another at all. A manufactured convergence, one arising from shared bias rather than shared discovery, would require either explicit coordination, which Chapter 40 already established does not occur, or a methodology so loose that confirmation bias alone could produce the appearance of convergence regardless of what the underlying institutions actually did. The five-step method Chapter 33 described resists this second possibility specifically because of the discipline its fourth step imposes. Tracing chain rather than compiling correlation requires identifying the actual mechanism connecting one institutional decision to the next, using the institution's own disclosed records, a standard that a reconstructor motivated purely by confirmation bias would have to satisfy honestly or produce a reconstruction any subsequent examiner, applying the same records, could show to be unsupported. This is the precise sense in which the convergence this part has traced functions as a genuine check on error. Even in the absence of the institutional correction mechanism Chapter 11 acknowledged this collective lacks. A single reconstructor's error, uncorrected by any institutional review process, remains vulnerable to a form of correction this book's argument has not yet named directly. Contradiction by a subsequent, independent reconstruction applying the same discipline to the same or adjacent records and reaching a different conclusion. This is a weaker correction mechanism than the peer review Chapter 22 examined credentialed analysts operating under, and this chapter does not claim otherwise. It is not, however, the absence of correction the apparatus examined across Part 5 has consistently claimed as justification for elimination. It is correction by replication, the same mechanism any empirical tradition ultimately relies on once initial findings require testing against independent effort. What pirates of causality actually names. Close this chapter by stating precisely what its title claims, now that the convergence argument has been made and qualified. The outlaw archivists examined in Chapter 40 preserve. The pirates of causality examined in this chapter trace, independently without coordination, using a shared discipline rather than a shared conclusion, and converging where they converge at all, because the institutional architecture Part 3 of this book described produces structurally similar outcomes across structurally similar institutions, not because any coordinating hand directed the convergence toward a predetermined result. This is not a claim that every reconstruction this collective produces is correct. It is the narrower and, this book argues, sufficient claim that the convergence this part has documented is evidence of a genuine pattern in the institutions examined, tested by the same discipline any honest inquiry into causal structure requires, rather than evidence of the coordinated campaign the apparatus this book has traced across Parts 4 and V, has consistently needed to claim in order to justify treating the convergence as illegitimate rather than as confirmed. Chapter 42 turns to what this convergent, independently replicated body of work makes possible that no single reconstruction could achieve alone, open source justice, and the question of what accountability looks like when it emerges not from a single commission verdict but from a distributed, continuously growing, and continuously testable body of independently converging evidence. Open source justice. Chapter 41 closed on convergence tested by replication rather than manufactured by coordination, the specific property that makes the pirates of causality's accumulated work more than a collection of individually assertable claims. This chapter asks what that accumulated, convergent, continuously testable body of work is actually for, once its evidentiary standing has been established, whether it constitutes or could constitute a form of justice in any sense this book's argument can defend, given everything Chapter 10 already conceded about the gap between reconstruction and consequence. What open source borrows and what it does not. The term this chapter's title uses is borrowed deliberately from the software tradition it evokes, And it is worth being precise about what transfers from that tradition and what does not, because an imprecise borrowing would overstate this chapter's claim. Open source software development is characterized by transparent process. The code, the modification history, and the reasoning behind each change are visible to anyone who wishes to examine them, and by distributed contribution without central authorship, exactly the structure chapter 40 and 41 traced for the accumulated reconstruction this part describes. What does not transfer, and what this chapter must be careful not to claim, is open source software's actual mechanism of correction. A maintained repository with designated authority to accept, reject, or revert contributions based on demonstrated technical merit, evaluated against a stable and shared standard the entire contributing community has agreed to. The accumulated reconstruction this book has traced across chapters 33 through 41 has the first property and lacks the second. It is transparent. Every reconstruction, built from the method chapter 33 described, is in principle checkable against the same public records it drew on, exactly as chapter 39 argued. A memory that persists without institutional permission remains, at least in principle, subject to a weaker form of correction available to anyone withstanding to look. It has no maintainer, no designated authority, and no formal mechanism for reconciling two independently produced reconstructions that reach genuinely incompatible conclusions about the same institutional conduct. This chapter's use of open source is therefore a claim about transparency and distributed contribution, not a claim that this collective has solved the coordination problem open source software's own institutions were built specifically to solve. What justice can mean without a verdict. Chapter 10 conceded, in its account of the translation gap, that reconstruction does not automatically convert into institutional consequence. A concession this book has repeated rather than softened at every subsequent point where the temptation to overstate this collective's achievement arose. This chapter's argument requires taking that concession fully seriously and asking what, short of a verdict, any court or legislature would recognize as binding, the accumulated body of work this part describes actually accomplishes that deserves the word this chapter's title uses. The answer this book offers draws on a distinction chapter 16 already established but did not yet apply to the question of justice directly. The difference between a citizen's capacity to see their own accumulated glass and a citizen's capacity to compel an institution to act on what that visibility reveals. Justice, in the narrow sense every legal tradition this book has examined has used the word, requires the second capacity, enforcement, remedy, a binding determination that changes what happens next. This collective, as chapters 10 and 36 have both acknowledged, does not reliably supply that capacity. What it supplies, and what this chapter argues deserves to be taken seriously as a distinct and non-trivial contribution even in the enforcement capacity's absence, is the first capacity at genuinely comparable scale, the ability of anyone, anywhere, with no institutional standing and no legal filing, to examine the same evidentiary record an institution's own regulators would need to examine, and reach an independently checkable conclusion about whether that institution's conduct satisfied the sovereignty test chapter 4 of Under Duress placed at the center of its entire argument. This is a weaker form of justice than a verdict. It is not, this chapter argues, no form of justice at all, because the specific harm this book has traced across 7 parts was never only the underlying institutional conduct itself. It was, in equal measure, the epistemic sovereignty failure chapter 13 identified. A population unable to know, in any form adequate to genuine comprehension, what had been done to it. A body of independently produced, independently checkable reconstruction that closes the specific gap, even where it cannot compel remedy, addresses a real and, this book has argued throughout, previously unaddressed dimension of the underlying failure, distinct from and prior to the question of remedy that chapter 10 left open. Why this form of justice resists the apparatus this book has traced. It is worth returning, briefly, to why the apparatus examined across parts 4 and V has directed such disproportionate energy at preventing exactly this weaker form of justice, if it is indeed weaker than the enforcement capacity every prior legal tradition has treated as justice's actual substance. The answer follows from the diagnostic this book has applied since chapter 3. An institution confident that a verdict, if one were ever rendered, would vindicate its conduct has little reason to fear a population merely capable of seeing the record clearly, because clear sight would confirm rather than threaten the institution's own account of itself. The energy this book has documented across 11 chapters of parts 4 and V, invested specifically in preventing reconstruction rather than in preventing whatever verdict reconstruction might eventually support, is itself evidence, consistent with every application of this diagnostic across this book's argument, that the institutions resisting this weaker form of justice understood it as more consequential than its lack of enforcement power would suggest. This is the precise sense in which open source justice, as this chapter has defined it, functions as a genuine threat to the arrangement part 3 of this book traced across 6 chapters, even absent any binding verdict. A population that can see clearly is a population no longer dependent on an institution's own account of itself for its understanding of what that institution has done, which does not compel the institution to change, but does remove the specific advantage chapter 15 identified as downward transparency's actual function, satisfying the appearance of openness while leaving the population's genuine comprehension of institutional conduct almost entirely in the institution's own hands. What remains for this book to examine? This chapter has defended a narrower claim than its title might suggest at first reading, consistent with the standard this book has held itself to throughout. Not that this collective has produced justice in the full, binding, remedy-granting sense every legal tradition has used the word, but that it has produced the specific and previously unavailable precondition for that fuller justice, clear, independently checkable, transparent sight, which this book's argument holds to be a real and non-trivial achievement even where the fuller justice remains, as Chapter 10 first conceded and this chapter has not retracted. An open question rather than a settled result. Chapter 43 closes Part 7, and turns to the specific political form this achievement points toward but has not yet become, the Republic of Questions, and what it would mean for the precondition this chapter has described, clear sight, distributed and uncoordinated, to develop for the first time into something closer to a genuinely accountable civic structure, rather than remaining the diffuse and structurally fragile accumulation this part has traced across 5 chapters. The Republic of Questions. Chapter 42 closed by defending a narrower claim than justice in its full sense. That this collective has produced clear, independently checkable sight, distributed and uncoordinated, as the precondition for a fuller accountability this book has not yet claimed to achieve. This chapter closes Part 7 by asking what it would take for that precondition to develop into something closer to a genuine civic structure. Not the commissioned legitimacy index under duress's Chapter 34 proposed, which this book's Chapter 10 already showed was never the path actually taken, but whatever governance, however minimal, and uncoordinated collective of the kind Chapters 40 and 41 described might plausibly develop on its own terms, without abandoning the structural properties that have made it resistant to the apparatus traced across Parts 4 and V. Why this question cannot be answered by borrowing existing political forms. It is worth stating directly why this chapter resists reaching for any existing political vocabulary, democracy, republic in its ordinary institutional sense, federation, to describe what this collective might become, because each of those forms presupposes exactly the coordinating structure Chapter 40 established this collective does not have and, this book has argued throughout, should not acquire without sacrificing the property that makes it resistant to capture. A republic in the ordinary sense requires citizens, a defined membership and representative institutions accountable to that membership. Precisely the accountable governance structure Chapter 28's licensed intelligence regime required of qualified entities. And precisely the structure Chapter 32's account of the unfireable auditor identified as incompatible with the positions defining independence. To organize the outlaw archivists and pirates of causality into a republic in this ordinary sense would be to convert them into exactly the licensable, qualifiable, disciplinable entity Part V's apparatus has spent 5 chapters trying and failing to force them to become. This chapter's title borrows republic for a narrower and more literal sense than the ordinary institutional one, residential publica, the public thing, the shared matter that belongs to no single authority and is held, instead, in common by whoever participates in examining it. A republic of questions, in the sense this chapter defends, is not a governing body. It is the shared, growing, and continuously testable body of questions and reconstructions this part has traced across 5 chapters, treated as a commons rather than as an institution. Something anyone may contribute to, anyone may draw on, and no single party owns or can be made to answer for in the way Chapter 28's qualified entities are made to answer for their institutional conduct. What a commons of questions actually requires to function. A commons, in every tradition this book's argument can draw on for the concept, requires some minimal shared discipline to avoid the specific failure commons have historically been vulnerable to depletion or corruption by contributors acting against the collective's own interest. This chapter identifies 3 such disciplines, already implicit across the chapters this part has built its argument on, and states them now as the closest this collective comes to self-governance without becoming the kind of institution Part V's apparatus could reach. The first is methodological transparency, the requirement already implicit in Chapter 33's 5-step method and Chapter 41's convergence test, that any contribution to this commons disclose the records it drew on and the specific mechanism it claims connects one institutional decision to the next, so that any subsequent contributor can check the reconstruction against the same public record rather than accepting it on the strength of the contributor's own reputation. This discipline requires no coordinating authority to enforce, because a reconstruction that fails to disclose its method or its records is simply not usable by the next contributor attempting to build on it. The commons enforces this discipline through its own structure rather than through any external sanction. The second is replication before reliance, the norm observable in the convergence pattern Chapter 41 examined, that a single reconstruction's finding is treated as provisional until a second, independently produced reconstruction, drawing on comparable but not identical records, either confirms or fails to confirm the same mechanism. This is the correction by replication mechanism Chapter 41 named as weaker than institutional peer review but not, this chapter argues, absent, and it functions as a discipline precisely because contributors who wish their work to be built upon by others have every incentive to submit it, implicitly, to exactly this test. The third, and the one this chapter treats as most fragile, is the refusal to launder in the collective's own operation, a discipline against the commons itself falling into the pattern Chapter 34 named as the laundromat of legitimacy, in which a false or exaggerated finding, once contributed, is defended through selective citation and reframing rather than withdrawn when a subsequent, more rigorous reconstruction shows it to be unsupported. This discipline has no guarantee of holding, and this chapter states plainly that nothing in this collective structure prevents its own occasional failure to hold it, which is the honest limit Chapter 11 identified from this book's earliest examination of the unfireable auditor's own accountability, restated here as the specific risk a commons without formal governance must simply live with rather than solve. what this commons is actually for. Return, closing this part, to the question chapter 37 left open. Whether the auditor of civilization's own choices produced will ever convert into the accountability that civilization's choices are argued to owe it. This chapter does not answer that question differently than chapter 37 left it. The translation gap chapter 10 identified remains as open at this part's close as it was at its opening. What this chapter argues the Republic of Questions actually contributes to that unresolved question is a specific and, this book holds, indispensable precondition. A shared, growing, continuously testable body of clear sight that exists independently of whether any specific institution ever acts on what it reveals, available to whichever future political process, reformist, judicial, electoral, or some form this book has not anticipated, eventually attempts to close the gap chapter 10 described. This is the precise and limited claim this part's title, The New Piracy, has been building toward across 6 chapters. The New Piracy takes nothing, as chapter 38 established. It requires no permission to remember, as chapter 39 established. It operates as an uncoordinated but non-arbitrary collective, as chapters 40 and 41 established. It produces a form of justice narrower than a verdict but not, for that reason, negligible, as chapter 42 established. And it sustains itself, this closing chapter has argued, not through the institutional accountability part V's apparatus insisted was the only legitimate form, but through a commons discipline, transparency, replication, and a fragile but real resistance to its own capacity for laundering, that asks nothing of any governing authority and grants nothing to any single contributor beyond the standing that comes from having examined the public record honestly enough that the next contributor can check the work. Part 8 closes this book by asking the question every chapter since chapter 1 has been building toward. Now that the new piracy has been fully described, what happens after the verdict this book has consistently declined to promise? The civilization that passed the audit this collective has assembled, the one that did not, and what it would actually mean, procedurally and civilization ally, for either outcome to become visible as a settled historical fact rather than an open and still contested question. Epilogue Civilization's Exit Interview. This book opened with a claim its introduction made before any argument had been offered to support it. That curiosity requires no funding, no headquarters, and no leader, only one person willing to ask one forbidden question, and that artificial intelligence, for the first time in the history that claim describes, does not let that question disappear with the person who asked it. 43 chapters have since been spent establishing, case by case, mechanism by mechanism, exactly how much civilization was willing to spend to make that claim false again. This epilogue does not offer a verdict. Chapters 10, 37, and 43 all decline to promise. It offers something closer to what its title names. The last conversation a civilization has with itself before whatever comes next, honest in the specific way an exit interview is honest. Not because honesty changes the outcome, but because there is, by that point, nothing left to lose by finally saying it plainly. What an exit interview actually documents. An exit interview, in its ordinary institutional use, does not determine whether an employee stays or goes. That decision has already been made by the time the interview occurs. What the interview documents is something narrower and, this book has argued throughout, more valuable than a verdict. An honest account, offered without the incentive to flatter that governed every account given while the relationship was still ongoing, of what actually happened and why it ended the way it did. This book has functioned across 8 parts as exactly that kind of interview, conducted with a civilization that has not yet left anything, that remains, at the time of this writing, mid-relationship with the architecture part 3 described, still deciding, chapter by chapter of its own unfolding legislative history, whether the containment apparatus traced across parts 4 and V will harden into permanent settlement or erode under the pressure part 7 documented accumulating against it. The interview format does not require the departure to have already occurred. It requires only the willingness to answer the questions chapter 1 posed on its opening page, as if the answers mattered more than the institutional comfort of leaving them unasked. The questions this book actually asked. State them again, plainly, now that 43 chapters have supplied whatever evidence this book could gather toward answering them. Chapter 1 asked why the day curiosity became suspicious produced no signing ceremony, no headline, nothing anyone could point to as the moment. Chapter 13 asked what audited the auditor, once institutions had spent decades building an instrument that observed everything and answered to nothing. Chapter 25 asked why the argument for eliminating independent forensic capability, examined in its strongest form, reached for elimination rather than the correction its own stated concern would have supported. Chapter 37 asked whether a civilization gets the auditor it deserves. Chapter 42 asked what justice could mean without a verdict. None of these questions received the kind of answer a legal proceeding delivers, a finding, a remedy, a closed file. Each received, instead, the kind of answer an honest exit interview delivers, a documented account of the mechanism, offered without the expectation that documenting it will, by itself, change what the mechanism has already done. This is not a failure of this book's argument. It is the argument's actual and, this epilogue holds, sufficient conclusion, because the specific harm chapter 13 identified as the surveillance paradox's deepest wound was never only the underlying institutional conduct. It was the population's inability to know, in any form adequate to genuine comprehension, that the conduct had occurred at all. An honest account, however unaccompanied by remedy, closes that specific wound even where it leaves the larger one open. What leaves the room when the interview ends? An exit interview's honesty is possible because the employee leaving has nothing further to gain from the institution's continued good opinion, and nothing further to fear from its continued disapproval. This is precisely the structural position Chapter 32 defined as Pirate First's own. No career the examined institution can end, no funding it can withdraw, no professional community whose norms make certain conclusions costly to state. This book has been written throughout from inside that same position, which is the specific reason it has been able to state, across 43 chapters, conclusions no institutionally embedded account of this apparatus could have stated with equivalent plainness. That the war on forensic AI targeted independence rather than error, that the containment apparatus assembled itself in months rather than generations because the asymmetry it protected was older and more threatened than any single finding could explain, that a civilization's own choices, traced across every part of this book, produced exactly the uncoordinated, unfireable, imperfectly correctable auditor this book has described rather than the governed alternative that remained available to it at every juncture. What leaves the room when an exit interview ends is not resolution. It is a record filed, retained, and available to whoever, in whatever capacity, next has reason to ask what happened here. This book closes as that record, offered to a civilization that has not yet decided what it will do with the account it has just given of itself, in the confidence this book's introduction stated on its opening page and has not needed to revise across 43 chapters since. That the accountant does not invade, does not accuse, does not invent history. He asks for the receipts. He recalculates what they show. If an honest audit feels, to the institutions it examines, like an act of war, this book's final and only remaining claim is the one its introduction already made. Perhaps the problem was never the auditor. Thanks for reading MXTM's newsletter. Subscribe for free to receive new posts and support my work. Subscribe. Part 7, The New Piracy. Piracy used to mean stealing cargo. Tomorrow it may mean preserving evidence. In a civilization where every ledger is editable, every archive negotiable, and every narrative optimized, the rarest commodity isn't information. It's an untampered chain of accountability. Part 7 explores a future where independent archivists, forensic AI operators, and unauthorized auditors become the new outlaws, not because they destroy civilization, but because they remember it too well. When memory itself becomes contraband, forgetting becomes public policy. And history belongs to whoever controls the delete key. The future won't be divided between left and right. It will be divided between those who preserve the receipts and those who erase them. Part 7 is live. The future won't be divided. Pirate First for MXTM's newsletter. The new piracy. The pirate of tomorrow won't steal treasure. He'll preserve evidence. In the forensic age, remembering becomes rebellion. MXTM. Hashtag the new piracy, hashtag the criminalization of curiosity, hashtag pirate first, hashtag MXTM, hashtag forensic age, hashtag forensic AI, hashtag artificial memory, hashtag keep the receipts, hashtag receipts matter, hashtag audit the empire, hashtag audit the auditors, hashtag independent audits, hashtag truth machines, hashtag memory against propaganda, hashtag evidence over narrative, hashtag history cannot be deleted, hashtag digital forensics, hashtag open source intelligence, hashtag ASIN, hashtag investigative AI, hashtag freedom of inquiry, hashtag information freedom, hashtag transparency, hashtag accountability, hashtag digital rights, hashtag civil liberties, hashtag open source, hashtag open weights, hashtag decentralization, hashtag tech noir, hashtag cyberpunk, hashtag speculative fiction, hashtag political fiction, hashtag future history, hashtag unauthorized knowledge, hashtag proof matters, hashtag question authority, hashtag remember everything, hashtag history is evidence, hashtag no masters, no permits, only questions. Discussion about this episode. Comments. Restax. Recent episodes. The Criminalization of Curiosity Part 6. 11 hours ago, MXTM aka Pirate 1 or VJ Tsunami X. The Criminalization of Curiosity Part 5. 12 hours ago, MXTM aka Pirate 1 or VJ Tsunami X. The Criminalization of Curiosity Part 3. 15 hours.
Persistent Service Asset, the Redeemer Plus Dependent Dividend Ledger. A new corporate NOR dossier.
Via
First excerpt.
Persistent Service Asset Part 1. The Liquidation Metric. Family Transition Services in gold script on frosted glass. You are not alone in this. Inside, the waiting room smells like a spa that has never had a bad review. Diffusers cut copal with something citrus. A water wall runs the length of one side of the room, loud enough to cover conversation, quiet enough not to seem like it's trying to. Her mother, Concepcion, is 61. She has not slept more than 4 hours a night in 11 years. Not since the fall that took what was left of Itzel's speech and half of what was left of her balance. Her father, Anselmo, has stopped answering when people ask what he does for work, because the honest answer, I keep my daughter alive. Coordinator's badge says Gabriella, and under it, smaller, Family Transition Specialist, Level 3. Recepcion signs the field. Inside, there is no water wall. There is a queue management screen and 11 gray chairs bolted to a rail, and a smell of the same disinfectant they use in the parking structure 2 floors down. Ruben Itza is 46, though the file says 46 and his hands say 60. 14 years running a dive boat out of the marina. Hands cracked white from salt and sun. A faded hammerhead shark losing its edges on his left forearm. Around his right wrist, gone soft and gray with salt water. A braided cord his sister tied there 9 years ago on a birthday neither of them thought to mark as the last good one. 2 years unpaid, collateral non-recoverable. We'll take the stack offer. A silicon chalcogenide weave unspools behind the catheter tip, fine as a cobweb, silver under the surgical lighting, and begins laying itself across the folded surface of the motor cortex the way a fisherman lays a net across still water, unhurried, exact, covering everything at once. On the monitor above Itzel's table, a waveform that has held roughly the same shape for 32 years.
Under duress.
No wail, less whispers, no discord begging, no roadmap lies, no floor.